Here in Washington, speaking with Arun Gupta. Arun has a background as a venture capitalist, working in, technology, but he's written a new book called Venture Meets Mission. He has also been teaching at Stanford, at Georgetown, and a number of places, trying to train students both in the kinds of skills that you need to be an entrepreneur, but also how to apply that to, a lot of the challenges, the public challenges. As we've discussed in the past, one of the big problems is that young people really aren't interested in public service, and they don't bring the same kind of energy and enthusiasm to solving public problems as they do to, making money and getting rich in the private sector. And I think that Arun is one of the people that's really thought a lot about this problem. So maybe, why don't you just begin by describing, some of the main themes in your book and what those lessons from your background, in venture capital might have for people that do want to solve public problems. Oh, and I should mention also, he's now the CEO of an organization called NobleReach, whose purpose is, again, to encourage that kind of shift to public service. So, Arun, tell me about
Well,
the
Frank,
book.
first, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here with you and be able to talk about this, and having admired all your great work over so long. My journey to this is part of the story. I grew up in the DC area. My father's been working at Naval Sea System Command for 45 years. So, and he's still working there today. So, government service has been in my family for a long time. I then, as you alluded to, had a venture career, started at Carlisle, but then, the bulk of it was at Columbia Capital, where I was a general partner. It was founded by Senator Warner. And, there you saw the power and optimism that comes with entrepreneurship. In the latter half of that time, I was really investing at the intersection of mission, tech, and entrepreneurship. And you saw both the challenges, but the magic when entrepreneurs in tech and innovation could solve government large mission-oriented problems, specifically cybersecurity. I then started teaching, as you alluded to, at Georgetown, and then had the privilege of teaching at SIW.
That's Stanford and
Stanford
Washington,
and Washington.
for the uninitiated.
I started at Stanford and Washington, and the class I was teaching was actually called Valley Meets Mission. And it was really, how do you take the entrepreneurial spirit of the Valley and bridge and tie it to the mission orientation of DC to solve big problems, and would riff. Students shouldn't be wasting their time on Candy Crush 3.0 when we've got these big problems to go solve. And that was what inspired the book, and watching how it was resonating with the students. The overarching theme really is around that, right? How do we take this entrepreneurial spirit? And, Mike Morrell, who's one of my guest speakers, would say, what I love about your class is, 40% of the students probably don't, dislike government. The other 40% dislike entrepreneurial capitalism. And you're trying to land the plane by the end of the course that if we're going to solve big problems, we need to do this collectively. We need both. And that's what we try to do in the class, is really talk about, like, how do you create for-profit businesses to solve larger social problems, and that in doing so, how you collaborate with government to help you with the scale and reach, because alone a startup's not solving climate or cybersecurity or healthcare. And that's what we talk about in the book, right? And the why now for us is that we feel, and what I could feel while I was teaching, and I think you and I have chatted about this and feeling this with some of the students, is post-COVID, post-Ukraine, what's going on around the world geopolitically. You add, an existential threat with climate and environment, and then great power competition. I think this generation actually is more mission-oriented. I think they care about wanting to solve problems.
Well, the
and have
external
impact.
world is kind of forcing all these issues on them.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's forcing them on them, and then I think COVID gave them a period of time to be able to reflect and think about their role in it. Part of our theory on the case with what we're doing at NobleReach, but that we need to build the infrastructure to harness that energy and connect them to these opportunities. And I think that's what I saw in the class.
Yeah. You can give me some examples from the book of how that, entrepreneurial spirit actually can be harnessed, and what kinds of concrete ways you talk about in doing that.
Yeah, so in the book, a lot of it is storytelling of examples of different companies that are collaborating with government to solve social problems. Some of them are doing it more directly, high-profile ones like SpaceX or Moderna, where you have very outcome-based relationship. And for many people, they forget SpaceX is largely a government-funded entity, and that it was a very collaborative partnership. Obviously, with Moderna and what we in Operation Warp Speed as well was a level of collaboration that forced innovation from an entrepreneurial sector to solve these kinds of problems. And so what we see is that when you focus on the outcome and you let the private sector and the talent and the capital kind of mobilize accordingly, you can kind of innovate and come up with great solutions. Other companies that we look at is Commonwealth Fusion. And the idea that many times we disparage that you can't do good and make money. And in Commonwealth,
What does Commonwealth Fusion do?
They're creating energy solutions for climate and around nuclear energy. And they started off as a research project at MIT. What you find there, though, is that the grant gets cut, and then they try to go to the not-for-profit world to continue the research. And I think what they realized is that scale to the size of the problem and to do what they need to do, they had to become a for-profit. And so a bit of what we're trying to talk, and then through that, they were able to bring on top-tier investors like Breakthrough Energy and others. And I think that the takeaway in that story is that to create these large social solutions, there's a way to do this with a for-profit motivation. And bringing our mission-driven capitalism around that's really important. And we tend to many times think if something is doing good or it's good for society, that needs to be a not-for-profit. And that doesn't need to be the case. And I think especially with what we were just talking about earlier, those kinds of opportunities really resonate with the students on college campuses as they're looking to come out and build their career. And that's really what we try to harness. Another company we talk about is a how. They build their company. It was a company called 1901, which was really doing workforce development. But the service they were providing was a service of managed security services to government agencies. The difference in what they were doing was rather than sending labor into those offices, they were building centers in Southwest Virginia and upskilling talent that otherwise wouldn't be part of this ecosystem. So you start looking at different ways that we can also be addressing and bridging the digital divide and pulling people into this new economy. And you're seeing companies being very innovative with how they can kind of explore and do that.
So, a couple of questions. First of all, what kinds of capacities does the government itself need in order to manage these private companies and use them for public benefit? I mean, one of the critiques that's been made of the kind of outsourcing that's done is that it's kind of hollowed out government. It's so much easier to get a job in the private sector, and so even if the government is just a shell that's writing contracts for these companies, even that is a capacity that's not easy to maintain. So what do you really need to have on the public sector side in order to make this process work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it all starts with talent, right? You need folks inside that have been able to that understand the language of venture and entrepreneurs, and more importantly, at the core of this, and Frank, you've written a lot about this, is trust, right? This is about people, right? It's about getting people that have a shared language, a shared view of the world and values, but more importantly, it's trust. And so I think it starts with getting people on the inside that understand how these new ventures are getting created, and how do you collaborate with them. What's different about this than the hollowing out that we've seen is these aren't just services companies where you're just outsourcing jobs. These are companies that are building tech and capability that you're pulling inside a government to then help you solve problems. And that's a new evolution, right? We've had the evolution of folks outsourcing, a lot of the, like you said, the services. But now, with companies like Palantir and Anduril, and you could look at SpaceX and Ginkgo Bioworks, these are all companies that are building capability that the government can then harness, whether it be in a national security context, clean energy context, You look at the work that Jigar Shah is doing over at Department of Energy. A lot of it is taking, like, how do we create a new operating model whereby we can collaborate with government. You look at what's happening with Gina Raimondo and the CHIPS Act. Again, we're in a new age of industrial policy where we need government engaging with the private sector, but going a step further, being able to engage with the entrepreneurial sector to create this new capability for us, which, as you rightly pointed out, has gotten hollowed out.
Yeah.
Right. And, in the case of CHIPS Act, pulling national security and economic security together.
Well, so this, I guess, brings us to another critique that's made of this kind of dependence on the private sector. And it comes up in all of the discussions of industrial policy, which is that, if you let private companies carry this much of the weight of development, how do you prevent them from, over time becoming rent-seeking entities that are simply, looking for their government connections and putting more time and energy into maintaining that flow of government dollars rather than actually developing the technologies. This was something I thought about quite a lot because industrial policy, I think, got a bad rap in the whole kind of neoliberal period. And actually it's been used quite effectively, but a lot of that is a political issue of how do you prevent the private entities that are being funded by government from using that power to capture government in a certain sense. And that's really where I think a lot of the problems in earlier efforts in industrial policy fell short.
Yeah, and look, I think, this is, it's the right question to be asking, and it's what they're working on. And, look, there are lessons learned. You need to have multiple competitors, right? You can't be too dependent on one player. Having said that, I also think what's happened, Frank, as well, is that, especially in great power competition today, like our need to be able to innovate, and back to your point, because we've been hollowed out inside of government, we don't have a choice. If our national security infrastructure is going to innovate and continue to do great things, we need to find ways to bridge into the private sector. Now, the way we do that is not being dependent on only any one sole provider. And I think that's what government is learning on how to do that. But I also think there's other institutions that are helping bridge this. I'll point to, or we highlight in the book, an institution like InQtel, which you're probably familiar with. But what InQtel has done a really great job, and now they're in their 25th year of existence, is being that bridge between the intelligence community and the venture community, and identifying technology that the venture community has been investing in that would have applicability to the agency, right? And helping them bridge that. And what they're serving really is that currency of trust is what they're leveraging.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the geopolitical competition side of it.
Yeah.
You've got a problem, I would say, right now, because artificial intelligence and kind of generative AI that everybody's been talking about lately requires a huge level of resources. Fei Li, that's one of the directors of the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute, wrote an article a couple of months ago basically saying that her lab at Stanford, which is probably the preeminent academic institution looking at AI, cannot afford the machines that are being used to create, this kind of capacity in AI. That only the private sector, they don't exist anywhere in government, it's only in the private sector. A lot of people would justify this by saying, well, we're in a competition with China, and if we don't develop these capacities, the Chinese are going to do it, and we're going to lose the geopolitical race. On the other hand, is it a little bit troublesome that, only a private sector company can possibly generate this kind of capacity? Or do you think that that's something that, ultimately we'll be able to control and use for public purposes?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. And I think, in general, we need to be building that capacity more broadly, right? I think inside the government, they're trying to identify ways to make some of those investments to broaden out that capacity and availability to folks in the private sector. so that you're not limited to just a few that have the ability to do that, and then they're the only ones that can innovate appropriately. And back to your point, you need to create a competitive platform. But that's not only in AI, that's in chips today. Anywhere where you have a large capital investment required to be able to then innovate and build. We talk about a company in the book called National Resilience that was actually really just created after COVID, but it's become now the platform for vaccine manufacturers to use on demand. But what they're trying to do is create that platform so that everyone doesn't need to do it on their own and go directly. So to your point, I think there are models there where government and the private sector need to be creating these kind of platforms for folks to be able to collaborate with.
How do you develop that spirit of public service that's needed to get people on the government side to be interested in issues like this and to work with private sector companies? I think we went through this long period, you just mentioned it yourself, where there had been a denigration of government. I think it really begins in the 1980s.
Absolutely.
Where, you have people like Ronald Reagan saying government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And I still see that with my students that are very reluctant to want to go into government, especially those people that have the background and the smarts to go make a lot of money in the
Yeah, so let's unpack this because it's a really important point that you're raising, and we have a theory on the case, and we're going to see how this plays out. I think part of the theory on the case starts with that we do believe this generation is more mission oriented than before. Having said that, as we point out in the book, less than, I think, 6% of tech workers in government today are under the age of 30.
Yeah.
We have 4 times as many over the age of 60.
Yeah.
So we're upside down, right? As you know, the average age at any of the big tech firms is probably low to mid 30s. Now, there's 2 conclusions you could reach. One could be that this generation doesn't care, or the other could be this generation cares, but we haven't modernized the infrastructure to connect this generation to these opportunities. We, with what we wrote in the book, but what we're also doing with NobleReach, are subscribing to the second. We're saying this generation actually cares more than the previous generations did. But we have an outdated way of trying to connect them to these opportunities, and we're using an outdated language to connect them. I say the government sells careers, but the students are buying experiences, right? The government sells jobs, but the students are buying mission. So what does that mean? If you tell a student, go to USA Jobs to find something that you could do for the next 30 years, you're sending them first to DOS. They're living in an iPhone 15 world. And when what they're really looking for is but if you tell them, here's a mission experience you could have for 2 to 3 years, much like Teach for America does so effectively, our experience right now has been these students are extremely excited about it. And they're searching for it. Again, small data point examples, but we did an internship program last year. We didn't have a website up. We were marketing mission tech and entrepreneurship for 5 spots. We had 650 applicants. This year we've just launched our internship program for 10 spots, and in the first 48 hours we had 1,200 applicants. So I think there's pent up demand. It's the language that we use, right? I think also it's meeting the student where they are, as opposed to telling them to come where you are into these opportunities.
Look, on that issue, I'm completely with you. One of the issues that I've been wrestling with is how to modernize the American public sector. And I think that given our civil service rules, our compliance requirements, we make it really, really hard for any young person to actually go into government. It takes months longer to actually get a decision on employment in the government than it does in the private sector. Kind of financial disclosure, the numbers of forms that you have to fill out all become big deterrents, and I think that's one of the reasons why the workforce is aging to such an extent.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we need to create the easy button for the application process, right? Because what happens is, the students, even the ones that want to go in, right? And, we have a structural problem where, in most engineering and business schools, there probably isn't a professor or an advisor that's advising them to go do something public service oriented. The agencies aren't showing up on campus to recruit because they don't have the resources. So we shouldn't be surprised that the students aren't magically finding, the spirit to go there. And when we were writing the book, I was chatting with Jason Mattini, who's now CEO at Rand, but who was running CSET, and at the time he was at the NSC. And he even said, Arun, like, if I could wave a magic wand, it would be great to have a not-for-profit that sat outside of government, that helped government coordinate talent for government, to help us do it at scale. So it's not each person, each agency doing it itself, but we cut across. And I think that helps with the modernization process that you're referring to, right? Because, look, students want to feel recruited. It's a human emotion, right? They want to feel, that what they're doing is going to be valued in a way by their peers, right? So there's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of like explaining what that is. We talk about this notion of trying to galvanize from why to wow. It was 2 CS students. One was selected to, both female. One was selected to do Kessel Run, a prominent military software factory. And she tells her friend she's going to go to Kessel Run and go to government. Friends go, why would you do that? Like, why would you go to government when you can do all these other things in the Valley, right? Her other friend was selected to do Teach for America, and her friends go, wow, that's amazing. You're going to serve, you're going to give back, and then you can go do whatever you want. And it's that paradoxical juxtaposition, Frank, which is like the person going into government's not even viewed as service. And this idea that it's about the money, like the person going to Teach for America is probably earning half as much as that it would make if they took the government job.
Or less.
Or less. So it's something deeper, right? This is about prestige, respect with your peers, but then also unpacking it, being viewed as a career enhancer. So that you feel like when I come out in 2 years, I might decide I want to stay there. Or I might decide that like I want to go do something else. And my experience in government will be respected. And I'll give you a good example, like, everyone goes like, well, can you do this in government? How will it work? And I'm like, again, you got to boil government down into kind of more its molecular levels, its organizations and people. And so parts of government are doing it already, right? You look at Jen Easterly at CISA, and I chat with her, and she's like, look, I want students coming in for only 2 or 3 years. I want them to then go back out to the private sector and be forward deployed CISA folks at the big tech firms or the financial banks.
But you had to create a special cutout for that kind of employee because that doesn't correspond to normal civil service rules.
That's exactly right.
And we do that with lawyers, and there's certain categories.
There's certain categories.
We really need to expand that, very broadly.
And that's a little bit of what we've tried to show in the book is like some places are doing it already and they're doing it well. So really the question isn't like what should we do, but it's like how do we do more of this? And what's keeping us from making this the norm rather than the outlier?
Now, on the private sector side, have norms there been changing? I remember, a few years ago when it was discovered that Google or Alphabet or one of these big companies was doing work for the Pentagon.
Maven, Project Maven.
Yeah, a lot of the employees got really upset about this, and why are you working with these baby killers and so forth. Do you think that's changing now?
So it's really interesting you asked that question. I think that to me, that's been the biggest surprise, both as we were writing the book, but then as we've now started the foundation, has been the complete interest by the private sector in embracing the notion that we are part of this. We need to find a way to engage with government. Now, we may not be able to do it directly, but we can support an organization or collaborate in some way. So I'll give you an example. So one of the big tech firms that you're alluding to, said, look, Ukraine changed everything, and said one, maybe we should have never left, but nonetheless, I think it's put a sensitivity, I think, in that younger generation that all these companies are part of the geopolitical fight, right? When you're using, your communication tools, your sensor tools, your tracking tools, et cetera, on the battlegrounds, they all feel like they're part of it, right? And and this is where I think we're seeing a sea change shift in a very short period of time, where all of a sudden the idea of even national security being a negative is now viewed as a way to maintain democracy, right? Because you see those same tools being used effectively by these Ukrainians that are, and you look at how even they're fighting, and a lot of that, and you notice with a lot of the work you're doing because you've been out there, But look, it's venture-backed companies that are providing some of this geospatial information that's providing the intelligence,
Yeah.
for the Ukrainians to fight.
I don't know if you want to address this question, but it also raises some difficulties. Elon Musk at one point decided that he didn't like the idea of Ukrainians attacking Crimea, and he used his influence over SpaceX and his satellite business to stop it. So it was like running a private foreign policy, which seems to me not the role that a CEO ought to be playing.
That's exactly right. Look, all I can really say on that comment is that we need to learn lessons from that to make sure you're not dependent. Back to your original question earlier in this conversation.
So it gets back to the competition. And
you got to have multiple players, right? And I think, look, we're still learning, in this process of what's the right way of collaboration, especially when we're dealing with new ventures. Again, it's different when these are large companies. You can give out different contracts to different folks. But how do you do that with multiple ventures out there where someone may accelerate faster than the other players? But how do you maintain a level of competition so that there's not a complete level of dependency in these kinds of situations, right? And I think people are now realizing that, and they need to take that into account as we start collaborating. But having said that, I don't think we have a choice but to collaborate because we didn't have the capability ourselves to be able to do that. And so, and Frank, I write about this in the book. Is we think about great power competition, and you clearly is such a thought leader on this. But part of our contention is that the two superpowers that this country really has always had has been our ability to create talent. You look at our higher ed ecosystem, and our ability to innovate, which is our entrepreneurial ecosystem, and contend that it's still orders of magnitude better than anywhere else in the world. And the evidence is that everyone from the world comes here to do both. But to your point, we've kind of not really aligned those or coordinated those around public service and government efforts, right? But if we do, I think that's why we write the book with optimism, is that this is a generational opportunity sitting in front of us. Because those are both ecosystems that are very difficult to replicate. They're deeply cultural, right? You don't just... And if they were easy to replicate, you'd have them all over the world, and you don't. Right? There's something deeply, unique about why it's, and I think a lot of that goes into the core of, democratic values and freedom of expression and ideas and exchanging and debating and letting things fail and, letting people come back from failure and backing them again. Those are, that doesn't happen everywhere.
No, that's absolutely true. Even in Europe, that would like to be competitive in this area. Certainly they've got the education and wealth to do it, but they just don't have that same spirit, especially around failure.
No, that's exactly right. And and the interesting part in this, Frank, which is always the touchy thing when you're touching government, writing about something related to government, has been in sitting down with folks that are on the D side or the R side, and explaining both as we were interviewing them for the book, or even talking about what we're doing at NobleReach. They all had the same question, and that question was, how can we help? And I will say that was deeply heartening to see that this is at least an area we can all agree on. How do we get better talent around government, and how do we get better innovation around government, right, to make our country stronger? And that it's not a political issue. That's just how do we do this? And I think there's a common will there. We've been surprised at how the book's been received in that context, and I think partially it's because it is, where pessimistic news tends to dominate. We're trying to throw a little bit of optimism out there, but I deeply believe it. I've got two boys in college. I'm teaching these classes with these students, and I tell them this is a generational, this is a multi-decade run you can have in solving these big problems, but doing it again in a for-profit way, and using government as a part of your career journey, right? And I think societally, that's going to be the, creating those bridges is what we need to be doing more of.
Right, right. Okay, well, Arun Gupta, thanks very much. So his book is Venture Meets Mission, and I hope that your message gets out to a lot of young people, because we, as you said, really need younger talent in government and working with the private sector, and we need a private sector that's much more oriented towards public purposes, and I think both of those come together in what you've written.